Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that shouldn't be possible. A man who married the King of England's sister without permission and lived. Who pissed off Henry VIII repeatedly, spectacularly, and died in his bed at 61. Who hated Anne Boleyn so openly that everyone expected him to lose his head when she became queen, and instead he outlived her by 9 years. Who abandoned women, betrayed friends, and supported executions of people he'd known for decades, all while staying as Henry's best friend. Before we go further, if you're enjoying this kind of content, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how global this community is. Get comfortable, grab a drink, turn on that white noise if you need it, because tonight's going to be a long one, and you're going to need to hear every word of this. 1515, a man commits treason, marries the king's sister, in secret, in France, without asking, without permission. Weeks after she'd been widowed from the King of France, his name is Charles Brandon, the king's best friend. The man Henry VIII trusts more than anyone, and by every law in England, by every precedent in royal history, Brandon should be dragged back to London in chains, should have his head separated from his body, should be made an example of what happens when you betray a king. Henry is furious. The court expects blood. Brandon expects death. He writes letters begging for mercy, practically grovelling through ink and parchment. And then, nothing. A fine. A massive one, yes, but his head stays attached. His titles stay intact. Within a year, he's back at court. Back in the king's favour. Back to being one of the most powerful men in England. While Thomas More loses his head for refusing to sign a document. While Anne Boleyn loses her head on fabricated charges. While Thomas Cromwell loses his head after a decade of loyal service. While bishops and nobles and Henry's own wives are executed for less, Charles Brandon survives everything. He survives secretly marrying Henry's sister. He survives publicly hating Henry's second wife. He survives decades of spectacular failures, reckless decisions, and behaviour that would get anyone else killed, and he dies peacefully. Wealthy, secure, at 61 years old, surrounded by family, still Duke of Suffolk, still technically in royal favour. How? How does that work? How do you piss off the most dangerous king in European history and not only live but thrive? What did Brandon know that everyone else missed? What was his secret? That's what we're unpacking tonight, because Charles Brandon wasn't just lucky. He was calculating, strategic, and he understood something about Henry VIII that smarter men, more loyal men, more principled men never figured out, or figured out too late. Brandon was part of Henry's inner circle, the Brat Pack, young men who grew up with the king, who jousted with him, drank with him, whored with him, shaped who he became. Will Compton, the quiet one who knew all the king's secrets. Anthony Knivet, the warrior who could actually keep up with Henry in the tilt yard. And Charles Brandon, the most audacious, the most reckless, the one who pushed every boundary and somehow never paid the price. These weren't advisors, they weren't politicians, they were Henry's friends. Or what passed for friendship when one person can have you executed on a whim. They could say things that would get other men killed. They could fail in ways that should have been unforgivable. They could cross lines that were supposed to be sacred. But even among this protected group, Brandon was special, because he didn't just push boundaries, he obliterated them. Married women he shouldn't have, abandoned them when it suited him, made enemies of queens, spent fortunes he didn't have, ignored direct orders, and every single time Henry forgave him. Until you look closer, until you see the pattern. Because Brandon didn't survive through friendship alone. He survived through something darker, through knowing exactly when to grovel, when to disappear, when to sacrifice other people to save himself. Through understanding that Henry didn't want friends, he wanted mirrors, people who reflected back exactly what he wanted to see. And Brandon was the perfect mirror, empty enough to show Henry whatever Henry needed, flexible enough to bend without breaking, shameless enough to do whatever survival required. But here's where it gets interesting. Here's what makes Brandon's story more than just another tale of a Tudor survivor. Brandon hated Anne Boleyn, openly, viciously, and she hated him right back. Two of Henry's closest companions, two people who understood how to manage the king better than anyone. And they despised each other with a passion that should have destroyed them both. When Anne rose, when she became queen, Brandon should have fallen. When Anne pushed Henry to remove Brandon from court, to sideline him, to destroy him the way she destroyed others who opposed her, everyone expected it to work, but it didn't. Brandon survived her rise, and then he survived her fall. Watched her lose her head, and felt nothing but satisfaction. So tonight, we're going deep into who Charles Brandon actually was, into the brat pack that surrounded young Henry and shaped the king he became, into Brandon's spectacular failures and even more spectacular recoveries, into his secret marriages, his abandoned women, his quiet betrayals, into his hatred of Anne Boleyn and what that hatred reveals about Tudor politics, into the specific strategies he used to survive when everyone around him was dying. Because by the time we're done, you're going to understand something about power that most people miss. It's not about being the smartest or the most loyal or even the most useful. It's about being exactly what power needs you to be, even if that means becoming nothing at all. Charles Brandon survived Henry VIII, but what did he have to trade away to do it? What does it cost a man to live that long in the shadow of a tyrant? And was survival actually victory, or just a different kind of death? Let's find out. Charles Brandon wasn't born to the life he lived. He wasn't nobility, wasn't royalty, wasn't even particularly wealthy. He was the son of William Brandon, Henry VII's standard bearer, the man who'd carried the Tudor banner into battle at Bosworth Field in 1485. That sounds impressive until you understand what it actually meant. Standard bearers weren't commanders. They weren't strategists. They were glorified servants. Important servants, yes. Trusted ones, absolutely. But servants nonetheless. Men who held the king's banner high so everyone could see where the king was fighting. Men who became targets for exactly that reason. William Brandon died at Bosworth, cut down while carrying Henry VII's standard. Legend says Richard III himself killed him in the final desperate moments before Richard's own death. The story probably isn't true. Battle legends rarely are. Men die in chaos and later someone decides it makes a better story if it was the king who killed them. But true or not, the story mattered. It gave young Charles Brandon something valuable. A martyred father. A family connection to the Tudor victory. A reason for Henry VII to take him in as a ward of the crown. So Charles Brandon grew up in the royal household, not as family, not as nobility, but as a ward, someone being raised on royal charity. Given an education he wouldn't have gotten otherwise, trained in arms, in courtesy, in the elaborate dance of court politics. He learned to joust, to fence, to ride. He learned to dress, to dance, to speak the language of power, even though he wasn't born to it. And crucially, he met Prince Henry. Henry wasn't supposed to be king. He was the spare, the second son. Arthur, his older brother, was the heir, the one being groomed to rule, the one all the attention focused on. Henry was just there, important because royal blood is always important, but not the centre of everything. Not yet. Charles Brandon was probably a year or two older than Henry, close enough in age to be a companion rather than a servant, and they became friends. Real friends, as much as friendship is possible when one of you is a prince and the other is a ward. They jousted together in the tilt yard. They competed. They pushed each other. They developed the kind of bond that forms in youth when everything still feels possible. This matters. Because when Arthur died suddenly in 1502, fever, possibly the sweating sickness, possibly just bad luck, everything changed. Prince Henry stopped being the spare and became the heir, the future king, the centre of attention. the person everyone suddenly cared about very, very much. And Charles Brandon had known him before, had been his friend when Henry was just the second son. That history, that connection, it would become the foundation of everything Brandon built. The reason he could push boundaries other men couldn't. The reason Henry forgave him when forgiveness should have been impossible. When Henry VII died in 1509, his son became Henry VIII at age 17. Nearly 18. Young, strong, athletic, handsome. Everything his father hadn't been. Henry VII had been careful, paranoid, a man who'd won his throne in battle and never trusted that someone wouldn't take it from him the same way. He'd squeezed England for money, executed potential rivals, kept the nobility weak and dependent. His son wanted none of it. Henry VIII wanted glory. He wanted to be a warrior king like Edward III or Henry V. He wanted tournaments and wars and magnificent displays. He wanted to be loved rather than feared. He wanted to be everything his careful, paranoid, penny-pinching father hadn't been, and he surrounded himself with men who would enable that vision. Men who wouldn't lecture him about responsibility or caution or the tedious necessities of actually governing. Men who would joust with him, hunt with him, drink with him, make him feel like the magnificent warrior king he wanted to be. Enter the brat pack: Charles Brandon, Will Compton, Anthony Knivett, Nicholas Carew, Francis Bryan. A rotating group of young men who became Henry's inner circle, his companions, his enablers, the men he actually wanted to spend time with. They weren't his counsel, they weren't his advisors, they were his boys, his crew, the men who made him feel young and powerful and invincible. And Henry showered them with gifts, titles, and opportunities that would have taken other men lifetimes to earn. Will Compton became groom of the stool. Yes, that means he attended the king during his most private bathroom moments. It sounds humiliating until you realise it meant constant access, intimate conversations, the kind of influence that comes from being present when everyone else is locked outside. Compton became wealthy beyond his origins just from being the man who literally held the king's chamber pot. Anthony Knivett became master of the horse, a position that meant constant proximity. He managed the king's stables, organised hunts, jousted alongside Henry in tournaments. Knivett was genuinely skilled, one of the few men who could actually match Henry in the tilt yard without making it obvious he was holding back. That kind of skill was valuable, rare. Knivett could make the king look good without making him look protected. And Charles Brandon became everything. Jousting partner, drinking companion, military commander, diplomat. The man Henry trusted more than anyone, except perhaps Catherine of Aragon, in those early happy years of marriage. By 1514, Brandon was Viscount Lisle. By 1514, he was Duke of Suffolk, an actual duke, one of the highest ranks of nobility in England, created from nothing, from royal favour, from friendship. Henry had reached down into the gentry, pulled out a man he liked, and made him one of the most powerful nobles in the land. The old nobility lost their minds. Families who'd held titles for centuries, who traced their bloodlines back to William the Conqueror, who considered themselves the natural rulers of England. They watched this upstart get elevated above them. This son of a standard bearer, this man with no ancient lineage, no great estates, no historic claim to power. Just a pretty face and the king's favour. They called him an adventurer, a social climber, a man who'd seduced his way to power through charm rather than earning it through blood or service. They watched him joust, watched him drink, watched him dress in clothes that cost more than their annual incomes, and they seethed. They weren't entirely wrong. Brandon was absolutely a social climber. He did use his friendship with Henry to accumulate wealth and power at a rate that would have been impossible any other way. He did see opportunities and grab them with both hands, consequences be damned. But here's what the old nobility missed. Brandon wasn't just charming, He was useful. He could joust better than almost anyone in England. Genuinely skilled, not just adequate. He could lead men in battle. He could negotiate with foreign courts. He could organise tournaments and entertainments that made Henry look magnificent. He could be trusted with sensitive diplomatic missions because he understood politics even if he wasn't born to them. And most importantly, more importantly than anything else, he knew how to make Henry feel good about himself. That was the real skill, the one that mattered most, the one that kept him alive for decades. Brandon had a gift for making the king feel like the greatest man who ever lived. Strong, wise, generous, beloved by his people and his friends. Every interaction with Brandon reinforced Henry's best image of himself. And Henry, young and insecure beneath all the bravado, needed that reinforcement constantly. That gift kept Brandon alive through marriages, scandals, betrayals, and the increasingly paranoid final years of Henry's reign. While other men calculated and plotted and tried to control the king through policy or principle, Brandon just made him laugh, made him feel powerful, made him feel like himself. But it wasn't always smooth, not even close, because Brandon had a fatal flaw. He was impulsive, spectacularly impulsive. He saw something he wanted and he took it, consequences be damned. Calculated risks later, suffered the fallout afterward, begged for forgiveness when things inevitably exploded. And what Brandon wanted, more than anything, more than titles or wealth or power, was women. Brandon married at least 4 times, possibly 5, depending on how you count and which marriages you consider valid. And almost every single one of those marriages created a scandal that should have destroyed him, should have cost him his titles, his lands, his head. Instead, he just moved on to the next one. His first marriage, or possibly his second, the records are deliberately murky, was to Anne Brown. The daughter of a knight, not particularly wealthy or well-connected, but respectable. She gave Brandon 2 daughters, Mary and Anne. Evidence the marriage happened. Evidence it was consummated. Evidence there was some kind of commitment. And then Brandon left her. Just left. Claimed the marriage wasn't valid. Claimed there had been a pre-contract with someone else that made his marriage to Anne Brown null and void from the beginning. He walked away, abandoned her, abandoned his daughters, and married someone else. That someone else was Margaret Mortimer. And here's where it gets dark. Margaret was Brandon's ward, a young girl placed in his care for protection and guidance. She had lands, she had an inheritance, she had value. And Brandon, her guardian, the man legally responsible for her well-being, married her. He was probably in his late 20s. She was probably 14 or 15. Old enough to be married by Tudor standards, but young. Very young. And entirely dependent on the man who was now claiming her as his wife. This wasn't romantic. This wasn't a love match. This was Brandon taking advantage of a girl in his care because she had property he wanted. He married her, claimed her inheritance, took control of her lands, used her exactly the way guardians were explicitly not supposed to use their wards. And when he got what he wanted, when the legal documents were signed and the money was secured, he annulled that marriage too. His reasoning. The marriage to Margaret had never been valid because he'd been pre-contracted to Anne Brown. Remember Anne? The woman he'd just claimed he wasn't actually married to? Now suddenly that pre-contract was valid again. Real again. Meaningful again. Because it was convenient. The inconsistency was blatant. Shameless. Brandon had claimed the Anne Brown marriage wasn't real, so he could marry Margaret. Then he claimed it was real, so he could get out of the Margaret marriage. He contradicted himself openly, and didn't even bother trying to hide it. And no one stopped him, because he was the king's friend, because Henry thought it was funny, because the rules that applied to everyone else didn't quite apply to Charles Brandon. So he went back to Anne Brown, remarried her, legitimised their daughters, played the devoted husband for a while. She died shortly after. Maybe childbirth, maybe illness, the records don't say. And Brandon, now conveniently free and legally unmarried, started looking around for his next opportunity. This is who Charles Brandon was. Not a romantic, not a man driven by passion or principle or anything noble. He was driven by opportunity, by what would benefit him most at any given moment. And he was willing to bend any rule, break any promise, abandon any woman if it got him what he wanted. The old nobility watched all this with disgusted fascination. This is the man Henry had made a duke? This shameless social climber who treated marriage like a business transaction and women like property? This man had the king's ear, influenced policy, led English armies, yes. Because Henry didn't care about Brandon's marriage chaos. Henry thought it was entertaining. Proof that Brandon was bold, that he lived life fully, that he wasn't constrained by the boring rules that trapped everyone else. Henry VIII, at 25, wasn't interested in lectures about morality from men old enough to be his father. He wanted companions who were exciting, who took risks, who lived the way he wished he could live if he weren't constantly being managed by his council and his wife and everyone else who thought they knew better than the king. Brandon understood this, understood that Henry admired audacity more than he admired virtue, that the king would forgive almost anything if you approached it with enough confidence and then grovelled appropriately when things went wrong. So when Brandon committed his greatest scandal, the one that really should have ended him permanently, he didn't slink away in shame. He didn't try to hide it or minimise it. He owned it, begged for forgiveness with theatrical humility, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. But before we get to the secret marriage that nearly destroyed Brandon, we need to understand the world he was operating in. The Brat Pack, the culture these men created around young Henry. Because Brandon wasn't working alone. He was part of a system, a group of men who enabled each other's worst impulses and protected each other when things went wrong. Will Compton was the quiet one, the careful one, the one who understood that proximity to power required discretion more than it required brilliance. He wasn't flashy like Brandon, wasn't spectacularly skilled like Knivett. He was just there, always there, in the king's private chambers, in his presence during moments when everyone else was locked out. Compton saw things, heard things, knew things that could destroy reputations if they ever became public. As groom of the stool, Compton managed Henry's most private moments. He dressed the king. He attended him during toilet functions. Yes, literally. He was present during the vulnerable, undignified moments when even kings are just men with bodies that betray them. This sounds degrading, humiliating, the kind of position that should have been an insult rather than an honour. But in Tudor England, it was one of the most powerful positions in the kingdom, because it meant access, constant, intimate, unavoidable access to the king when his guard was down. Compton knew Henry's moods, knew when he was angry or anxious or melancholy, knew when to speak and when to stay silent, knew how to read the tiny shifts in tone or posture that signalled whether this was a good time to bring up a request or whether it should wait until tomorrow. That knowledge was power, the kind of power that couldn't be measured in titles or wealth, but was worth more than both combined. Because Compton could whisper in the king's ear during private moments and shape decisions in ways that were invisible to everyone else. He also managed Henry's early affairs, the mistresses, the secret relationships Henry conducted while publicly presenting himself as a devoted husband to Catherine of Aragon. Compton was the go-between, the man who arranged meetings, carried love letters, made sure the women were housed and provided for without creating public scandal. This made Compton both invaluable and dangerous. He knew too much, he'd seen too much. He was the keeper of secrets that could humiliate the king if they ever leaked. And in Tudor England, people who knew too much had a tendency to die suddenly. But Compton survived. He survived because he was careful, because he never traded on those secrets, never used them for leverage, never whispered them to rivals or ambassadors or anyone else who might use them against Henry. He just quietly managed the king's private life and accepted the rewards that came with that service: land, money, positions for his relatives. Compton became wealthy without ever appearing ambitious. He accumulated power without ever seeming to grasp for it. He made himself indispensable while remaining invisible. That's a rare skill. Most people at Henry's court were too visible, or too ambitious, or too obviously grasping. They made themselves targets. They created enemies. They drew attention from people who decided they needed to be destroyed. Compton avoided all of that. He stayed in the background. He was loyal without being obsequious. He was useful without being threatening. He served Henry faithfully for nearly 20 years, and when he died in 1528, natural causes, probably some kind of fever or infection, he died wealthy, respected, and in royal favour. That might be the greatest achievement of any member of the Brat Pack. To serve Henry that long, know that many secrets, and die peacefully in your own bed. It's almost miraculous. Anthony Knivett was different. He was the warrior, the one who could actually keep up with Henry in the tilt yard without embarrassing himself. Jousting with the king was dangerous in multiple ways that most people didn't fully appreciate. You had to be good enough to make it a real contest. If you were too obviously throwing the match, if you fell off your horse at the first touch or your lance broke too easily, everyone knew, including Henry. And Henry hated being patronised, hated feeling like people were letting him win because he was king rather than because he was skilled. But you also couldn't actually beat him, not decisively, not in a way that made him look weak or incompetent in front of the court, because that was humiliating, that was dangerous. Kings who looked weak in front of their nobles invited challenges, invited people to question whether they were fit to rule. So you had to calibrate perfectly. You had to give the king a real fight, hard enough that his victory felt earned, close enough that it looked exciting, and then lose in a way that seemed like luck rather than skill. Like the king was just slightly better, just barely faster or stronger or more accurate. Knivett had that balance. He could give Henry genuine competition without threatening his ego. He could ride hard, strike true, make it look spectacular, and then lose in ways that made Henry look magnificent. This sounds trivial, like sports, like games, but in Tudor England, prowess in the tilt yard was tied directly to political power. Henry believed he was a warrior king. He modelled himself on Edward III and Henry V, men who'd led armies and won battles and proven themselves in combat. His self-image was built on physical dominance, on being the strongest, the fastest, the most skilled. Men like Knivett reinforced that self-image. They made Henry feel like his belief in his own prowess was justified. They gave him victories he could point to as proof of his superiority. And in return, they gained access, favour, and protection from the most powerful man in England. Knivett was also genuinely skilled as a military commander. He led men in France during Henry's early wars. He understood strategy. He could be trusted with real responsibilities, not just ceremonial ones. That combination, athletic skill and military competence, made him valuable in ways that went beyond entertainment. But Knivett was smart enough to fade when things got dangerous. By the late 1520s, he'd quietly retreated from court. Not dramatically, not as punishment. He just stopped being as present, spent more time on his estates, less time in the tilt yard, less time in the line of fire. He'd seen which way things were going, had watched as Henry's temper shortened and his paranoia increased, had recognised that the easy, jovial days of the Brat Pack were ending, that staying close to Henry was becoming more dangerous than it was profitable. So Knivett got out. He disappears from court records in the early 1530s, probably died quietly on his estate sometime in that decade. No dramatic fall, no execution, no public disgrace, just a man who'd been smart enough to recognise when the game was changing and extract himself before he became a target. That takes wisdom, that most people at Henry's court lacked. Most people stayed too long, thought they were special, thought their relationship with Henry would protect them. They were wrong. Knivett wasn't. He left, he survived, but Charles Brandon stayed. Brandon remained at the centre of court life, even as it became increasingly treacherous, even as Henry's mood darkened and his temper became unpredictable, and the scaffolds at Tower Hill stayed busy. Why didn't Brandon leave? Why didn't he follow Knivett's example and retreat to his estates while he still could? Part of it was necessity. Brandon couldn't fade away quietly because he was too prominent, too wealthy, too tied to the royal family through his marriage. His entire position depended on remaining visible, on being useful to Henry, on maintaining his place in the king's favour. If Brandon retired to the countryside, people would notice. Henry would notice, and that absence could be interpreted as disloyalty, as abandonment, as a sign that Brandon thought he was too good for court life, or that he'd found something more important than the king's friendship. Henry didn't forgive that kind of perceived disrespect, even from old friends, especially from old friends. But part of it was also choice. Brandon genuinely seemed to believe he'd figured out the formula, that he understood Henry better than anyone else, that their friendship, however strained at times, would protect him through anything, that he could keep pushing boundaries and begging for forgiveness and surviving consequences indefinitely. And for the most part, he was right. But there were close calls, moments when Brandon miscalculated, when he pushed too far or not far enough, when he ended up on the wrong side of Henry's favour and had to scramble desperately to recover. The first and biggest of those moments happened in 1515, when Brandon committed actual legal, executable treason, and somehow talked his way out of it. Mary Tudor, Henry's younger sister, is 18 years old, beautiful, spirited, spoiled, the kind of princess who's been told her entire life that she's special and actually believes it. She's also political currency, one of the most valuable marriage pawns in Europe. Henry has plans for her, a French alliance. King Louis XII of France is looking for a wife. His previous wife has died. He needs a new one. He's old, 52, and sick. Gout, probably other ailments, not attractive, not young, not someone an 18-year-old girl would choose for herself. But that's not how royal marriages work. You don't choose, you're chosen. You're given away like property to secure alliances, prevent wars, strengthen dynasties. Your preferences don't matter. Your happiness doesn't matter. Only politics matters. Mary knows this. She's known it her whole life, but she doesn't like it. She begs Henry not to make her marry Louis. Cries, pleads, says she'll do anything else, marry anyone else, just not this old sick French king who will probably die within a year. Henry is sympathetic but firm. The alliance is too important. France and England have been enemies for centuries. This marriage could secure peace, could create goodwill, could prevent another expensive, bloody war that England can't really afford. So Mary makes Henry promise something. If she agrees to marry Louis, if she does this duty for England, then after Louis dies, and everyone knows he won't live long, she gets to choose her next husband herself. No, more political arrangements. No more trading her to whoever serves England's interests. She gets to marry for love. Henry agrees. He probably thinks Louis will live for years. Probably doesn't imagine that Mary would actually hold him to this promise. Probably figures he can renegotiate when the time comes. But he promises, in front of witnesses, Mary can choose her next husband. Mary marries Louis in October 1514, travels to France, endures a wedding where she barely knows the language and her new husband can barely walk. The French court is vicious to her. They call her La Hackney d'Angleterre, the Hackney of England, a riding horse, an animal. They whisper that she's too demanding, too vigorous, that she'll kill Louis with her expectations. And 3 months later, Louis dies. He literally dies 3 months after the wedding. There are jokes that Mary rode him to death, that her youth and energy exhausted him. that he died trying to satisfy a teenage bride. The humour is cruel, sexist, and completely typical of how royal women were treated. If a young wife outlives an old husband, it's somehow her fault. She should have been more passive, more decorative, less alive. Mary is now a dowager queen, 18 years old, widowed, alone in France, surrounded by people who hate her. Her situation is precarious. She has her dowry, gold, jewels, income from French estates. But she's vulnerable. She's valuable. Other men are already circling, trying to arrange a marriage that would give them access to her wealth and her royal connections. Henry knows this. He sends Charles Brandon to escort her home, to protect her, to make sure she gets back to England safely so they can arrange her next marriage to whoever benefits England most. This is already a questionable decision, because Henry knows Mary is fond of Brandon, more than fond. They've known each other for years. Brandon is handsome, age-appropriate, charming, everything an 18-year-old widow might find attractive after 3 months married to an elderly invalid. But Henry trusts Brandon, trusts him to do his duty, to bring Mary home safely, to not do anything catastrophically stupid. Henry sends Brandon with explicit instructions, clear instructions. Instructions so obvious they shouldn't need to be stated. Do not marry my sister. Do not even think about marrying my sister. Bring her home. We'll discuss her future then. But under no circumstances should you marry her without permission. Brandon agrees. Of course he agrees. He's not stupid. He knows marrying Mary without permission is treason. Knows it could get him executed. Knows it would destroy everything he's built. Knows it's the one thing Henry would never forgive. And then he marries her anyway. In secret, in France, probably in late January or early February 1515, weeks after Louis's death, before her official mourning period is over, before bringing her home, before asking permission, before doing any of the things a sane person would do. They marry quietly, in a private ceremony, with minimal witnesses, maybe a priest, maybe a French official who doesn't understand the politics, maybe no one at all. Just a private exchange of vows in a room somewhere, while the French court gossips and plots and everyone assumes Mary is still available for negotiation. Why? Why would Brandon, who'd spent years carefully managing his relationship with Henry, suddenly throw it all away? Why risk everything? His titles, his lands, his life, for a marriage he had to know would enrage the king? The charitable interpretation is love, that Mary begged him, that she cried and pleaded and said she'd rather die than be married off to another old king or foreign prince, that she reminded him of Henry's promise, that she could choose her next husband, that she wanted Brandon, that she refused to return to England unless he married her first, that she threatened to marry some French nobleman instead, which would humiliate England and ruin her value to Henry completely. Brandon, caught between betraying Henry and abandoning a woman he cared about, chose Mary, chose love, chose to honour her choice, even though it meant destroying himself. It's a romantic story. It makes Brandon look noble, self-sacrificing, willing to risk death for the woman he loved. But there's another interpretation, a more cynical one, and it's probably closer to the truth. Brandon saw an opportunity. Mary was the king's sister. Her blood was royal. Her children would be in line for the English throne. If Brandon married her, he'd be tied to the royal family permanently. Not just as a friend, not just as a favoured courtier, as family. His children would be Henry's nieces and nephews. His position would be unassailable. It was an elevation beyond anything he could achieve through favour alone, beyond what any duke could aspire to. He'd go from being a jumped-up servant to being part of the royal bloodline. His descendants could claim royal heritage, could potentially claim the throne if Henry's own children didn't survive. And Mary was offering it to him, begging him to take it. All he had to do was say yes and deal with Henry's anger afterward. So he said yes. He calculated that Henry's love for Mary would protect him, that Henry wouldn't execute his sister's husband if Mary wanted the marriage, that he could grovel and beg, and eventually Henry would forgive him, because what else could Henry do? The marriage would be consummated. Mary might already be pregnant. Henry couldn't undo it without humiliating his sister. Brandon gambled, took the biggest risk of his life, and then had to figure out how to survive the consequences. When Henry found out, and he found out quickly, because this kind of secret doesn't stay secret, he lost his mind, absolutely exploded with rage, the kind of fury that made everyone at court terrified, the kind that usually ended with heads on spikes. Brandon hadn't just married without permission. He'd married the king's sister, one of the most valuable political assets England had. He'd stolen her, ruined her value on the marriage market, made it impossible for Henry to use her to secure alliances with France or Spain or the Holy Roman Empire, made England look weak because the king couldn't even control his own family. It was betrayal, public, humiliating betrayal by the man Henry trusted most, by his best friend, by someone who'd looked him in the eye, promised to follow orders, and then deliberately done the exact opposite. The Privy Council wanted Brandon arrested immediately, wanted him dragged back to England in chains, wanted a trial for treason and an execution as quickly as possible, wanted his head on a spike at London Bridge as a warning to anyone else who thought about crossing the king. Some councillors probably enjoyed this. Finally, this jumped-up servant who'd gotten above himself would pay for his arrogance, would pay for all those years of special treatment, would learn that even the king's friendship had limits. Henry wavered. He was furious, hurt, betrayed. Brandon was his friend, his best friend, the man he'd trusted more than almost anyone. And Brandon had lied to him, had manipulated him, had used their friendship to get close to Mary and then stolen her. How do you forgive that? How do you move past that level of betrayal? How do you trust someone again after they've proven they'll put their own interests above explicit royal commands? The answer for most kings is you don't. You execute them. You make an example. You show everyone that there are lines that can't be crossed, not even by your closest friends. But Brandon didn't try to justify himself, didn't try to explain or rationalize or make excuses. He did the only thing that might work. He grovelled. Absolutely, completely, shamelessly grovelled. He wrote letters, long, desperate letters sent from France begging for Henry's forgiveness. Letters that read like a man terrified for his life. Because he was. He called himself unworthy, called himself a fool, said he'd been weak and stupid and had betrayed the best friend he'd ever had. Said he understood if Henry wanted him executed. Said he deserved death. Said he'd throw himself on Henry's mercy and accept whatever punishment Henry decreed, as long as it wasn't execution. Please, the letters said, please don't kill me. I'll do anything, pay anything, accept any punishment. I'll spend the rest of my life making this up to you. Just let me live. And he had Mary write letters too. This was crucial. Mary took all the blame. Said Brandon had tried to refuse her. Said she'd begged him, cried to him, threatened to marry someone else if he wouldn't marry her. Said she'd forced his hand. That if Henry wanted to punish someone, it should be her, not Brandon. This was strategic, brilliant really, because Henry loved his sister. She was one of the few people he was genuinely soft toward. One of the few people who could move him emotionally rather than politically. And if Mary was claiming responsibility, if she was saying Brandon had tried to resist and she'd forced the issue, then maybe Henry could find a way to be angry at the situation without being angry enough to execute his best friend. It worked, barely, by the thinnest margin. Henry agreed not to have Brandon executed, but there were conditions, harsh conditions, conditions designed to financially cripple Brandon and make everyone else think twice about defying the king. Brandon had to pay an enormous fine, £24,000, a fortune, more money than Brandon had, more money than he could raise quickly. It would bankrupt him, drain his estates, require him to sell property and take loans and basically start over financially. He had to return Mary's dowry from Louis. All the gold and jewels and income she'd brought back from France, all the wealth that had made her so valuable, Brandon had to hand it over to Henry's treasury. Couldn't touch it. Couldn't use it to pay his fine. Just give it back. He had to give up some of the lands Henry had granted him. The estates and incomes that had made him wealthy and powerful. Some of them went back to the crown, some went to other nobles. Brandon's income was cut dramatically. He had to publicly acknowledge his mistake, had to stand in front of the court and admit he'd been wrong, had to grovel in front of all the nobles who hated him, had to let them see him humiliated, reduced, put back in his place, and he had to stay away from court for months, maybe a year, had to disappear, give Henry time to cool down, time for the scandal to fade, time for everyone to move on to the next drama. Brandon agreed to everything, paid everything he could, and went into debt for the rest. He and Mary lived quietly in the countryside, Suffolk, away from court, away from attention. They had children, a son who died young, daughters who survived. They waited, and slowly, gradually, Henry forgave him. By 1516, Brandon was back at court, not constantly, not at the same level as before, but present, welcomed, still Duke of Suffolk, still technically in favour. Henry would never fully trust him again, that was clear. There was a distance now that hadn't been there before, a wariness, an awareness that Brandon had proven he would prioritise his own interests over explicit royal commands. But Henry kept him around, kept him close, because Henry needed what Brandon provided. Someone who remembered him before he was king, someone who made him feel young and powerful and beloved, someone who could make him laugh. The older courtiers, the professional politicians, the men on his council, they couldn't give Henry that. They were too careful, too aware that every word mattered, too focused on policy and politics and all the boring necessities of actually running a kingdom. They made Henry feel like a king. Brandon made him feel like himself, and that was worth more than obedience, worth more than loyalty, worth more than almost anything. But the marriage changed their relationship permanently, irreversibly. Brandon had crossed a line. He'd proven that his friendship had limits, that when pushed, he'd choose himself over Henry, that he couldn't be fully trusted. Henry never forgot that, never quite let it go. Brandon was still his friend, still in favour, but there was always that memory, that knowledge, that understanding that Brandon had betrayed him once and might do it again if the circumstances were right. So Henry watched him more carefully, trusted him less fully, gave him responsibilities but not secrets, kept him close but not too close. The easy, uncomplicated friendship of their youth was gone. In its place was something more complex, more transactional, still valuable but different. Brandon had survived, but he'd paid a price that went beyond money. He'd lost something he could never get back: Henry's full trust, the certainty that his friend would always choose their friendship over personal gain. And that loss would shape everything that came after. Every decision Brandon made, every risk he took or didn't take, every moment when he had to calculate whether pushing Henry was worth the potential consequences. Because Brandon had learned something in 1515, something he would remember for the rest of his life. Henry's forgiveness was possible, but it wasn't guaranteed, it wasn't automatic, and it came with costs that couldn't always be measured in gold or land or titles. Sometimes the cost was your relationship itself, and once you'd paid that cost, you could never quite get back what you'd lost. Mary Tudor, Brandon's wife, the woman he'd risked everything to marry, died in 1533. She was 37 years old. Some sources suggest she died of grief, that she couldn't cope with watching her nephew's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, a woman she loved, be destroyed so Henry could marry Anne Boleyn. That the chaos and religious upheaval of the early 1530s broke something in her. Others say it was probably illness, cancer maybe, some kind of tumour or wasting disease that was common and untreatable in the 16th century. She'd had multiple pregnancies. Her body had been through trauma. She died the way many women her age died, suddenly, painfully, with doctors who had no idea what was wrong. Brandon mourned her, probably. The records suggest he was sad, but he didn't let grief interfere with practicality. Within weeks, literally weeks of Mary's death, Brandon remarried. His new wife was Catherine Willoughby, who'd been engaged to Brandon's son, his teenage son. The boy was probably around 15. Catherine was 14. They'd been betrothed, a marriage arrangement that would have united two wealthy families and secured an inheritance. Brandon broke the engagement, took Catherine for himself, married his son's fiancée, a 14-year-old girl. Brandon was nearly 50. Let that sink in. His wife of 18 years was barely cold. His son had just lost the girl he'd been promised, and Brandon married her himself, for her inheritance, for her family connections, for her youth, because he could. It was the most shameless thing he'd done since abandoning Anne Brown 20 years earlier. More shameless, actually, because this time he was stealing from his own child, humiliating his own son publicly, showing everyone at court that Charles Brandon would sacrifice anything, even his children's happiness, for personal advantage. The court was disgusted, even by Tudor standards, even in a world where marriages were transactions and feelings didn't matter. This was beyond the pale. You didn't steal your son's fiancée. You didn't marry a girl young enough to be your granddaughter weeks after your wife died. You didn't make your own family look ridiculous for money. But Brandon did it anyway, because he'd done the calculation and decided the benefits outweighed the costs. Catherine's inheritance was substantial. Her family had connections. She was young enough to give him more sons. His legitimate male heirs from Mary had all died young. He needed to rebuild his line. Catherine was the most efficient way to do that. So he married her, and she, having no real choice in the matter, became the Duchess of Suffolk. Catherine Willoughby deserves a moment here. Because she wasn't just a victim of Brandon's opportunism. She was formidable in her own right. Sharp-tongued, well-educated, unafraid to speak her mind, even in a court where women's opinions were supposed to be silent or non-existent. She and Brandon had two sons together, Henry and Charles, both of whom survived to adulthood before dying of sweating sickness in 1551, just hours apart. A tragedy that would destroy Catherine years after Brandon was gone. But during their marriage, Catherine managed Brandon's estates competently. She had opinions about religion. She was a committed Protestant reformer who corresponded with continental theologians and supported radical preachers. After Brandon's death, she became known as a patron of scholars and a political force in her own right. She survived into Elizabeth I's reign, became a respected figure, managed to navigate the dangerous religious shifts from Henry to Edward to Mary to Elizabeth without losing her head or her estates. She was clever, adaptable, and significantly more principled than the man she'd been forced to marry. But in 1533, she was just a 14-year-old girl married to a man who'd taken her because it was convenient. And Brandon, having secured his new wife and her inheritance, went right back to doing what he did best, surviving at Henry's court while everyone around him fell. By the 1530s, the Brat Pack was effectively dead. The easy, jovial culture that had defined Henry's early reign was gone. Will Compton had died in 1528. Anthony Knivett had disappeared into quiet retirement. The other young men who'd surrounded Henry in his youth were either dead or had moved on to other positions. Only Brandon remained, still at court, still in Henry's orbit, still trying to maintain the friendship that had defined both their lives. But Henry was changing. The jovial young king was transforming into something darker, more suspicious, more willing to kill people who disappointed him. The break with Rome in 1533 had unleashed something. Once Henry had defied the Pope, once he'd declared himself a supreme head of the Church of England, once he'd proven he could remake reality through sheer willpower, there was no limit anymore. No authority above his own, no check on his power, and that unlimited power made him dangerous, paranoid, convinced that everyone was plotting against him, that anyone who questioned him was a traitor, that loyalty meant absolute obedience without hesitation or doubt. Brandon watched all of this unfold, watched men he'd known for decades get destroyed for opposing the king's will, watched the rules change in ways that made survival increasingly difficult. And then came Anne Boleyn. Anne had been around court for years. She'd been one of Catherine of Aragon's ladies-in-waiting. She'd caught Henry's eye sometime in the mid-1520s, and unlike his previous mistresses, Anne refused to sleep with him unless he married her. This was bold, unprecedented. Most women in her position would have accepted becoming the king's mistress and counted themselves lucky, accepted the gifts and money and position that came with royal favour. But Anne held out, said she'd be queen or nothing, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. Henry became obsessed with her, started trying to annul his marriage to Catherine, started the legal and theological process that would take years and eventually tear England away from Rome. All because Anne Boleyn said no, and Henry couldn't handle it. Brandon watched this with growing horror. He liked Catherine of Aragon, had known her for decades. She'd been a good queen and a faithful wife. She'd given Henry a daughter, Mary, and had suffered through multiple miscarriages trying to give him a son. She didn't deserve to be cast aside for a woman who, in Brandon's view, was a manipulative upstart. And Anne, Brandon hated her. Part of it was class. Brandon was sensitive about his own origins. He'd been elevated through favour, not blood, and he knew people whispered about it. He surrounded himself with the trappings of nobility, elaborate clothing, coats of arms, grand estates, trying to prove he belonged among the ancient families. Anne Boleyn was the same. The Boleyns were ambitious gentry who'd risen through service and strategic marriages. Anne's grandfather had been Lord Mayor of London. Impressive, but not nobility. Her father had clawed his way to an earldom through diplomatic service and royal favour. Anne herself had no royal blood, no ancient lineage. She was exactly what Brandon was, a social climber who'd risen through personality and opportunity. But Anne had something Brandon didn't: education, sophistication, continental polish. She'd spent her teenage years in the French court. She spoke French fluently. She could discuss theology and poetry and philosophy. She had the kind of cultural capital that Brandon, for all his titles and wealth, lacked, and she made sure he knew it. Anne had a sharp tongue and no fear of using it. She was witty, sarcastic, and unafraid to mock people she considered beneath her. And she definitely considered Brandon beneath her. She called him a jumped-up servant, made jokes about his humble origins, treated him with barely concealed contempt. Brandon, not used to being disrespected, especially not by a woman, was furious. He complained to anyone who would listen. Called Anne an upstart herself, a Boleyn nobody trying to act like royalty. Pointed out that she was exactly what she accused him of being, someone elevated beyond their station, through royal favour rather than birth. The hypocrisy was stunning. But Brandon didn't care. He hated Anne. And when she became queen in 1533, when Henry married her and crowned her and made her the most powerful woman in England, Brandon's hatred intensified. Because now he had to bow to her, had to show her respect, had to pretend to support a marriage he thought was a disaster, had to watch Catherine of Aragon, a real queen, a woman with royal blood and decades of service, be humiliated and cast aside for this Boleyn girl who'd seduced the king. Brandon made his feelings known, not cautiously, not diplomatically, openly, dangerously. He criticised Anne to other courtiers. He questioned the annulment. He associated with people who supported Catherine and opposed Anne. He attended the christening of Anne's daughter Elizabeth in 1533, but only because he had to, and everyone could see his resentment. This was incredibly stupid. Suicidally stupid. Anne was queen. She had Henry's ear and, for the moment, his heart. She had the power to destroy people who crossed her. And Brandon was openly, obviously, one of her enemies. Anne knew it, and she wanted him gone. She pushed Henry to remove Brandon from the Privy Council, to reduce his income and influence, to sideline him, to send him away from court on diplomatic missions, anything to get him out of her sight and away from the king. Henry resisted, partly because Brandon was his friend, and he wasn't ready to completely discard him, partly because he didn't like his wife telling him who he could and couldn't favour. Henry VIII never responded well to being managed, even by people he loved. Especially by people he loved, he needed to feel in control, needed to feel like decisions were his own, rather than being manipulated out of him. But Anne kept pushing, and there were moments when Brandon's position looked genuinely precarious, when it seemed possible that Henry might sacrifice his old friend to keep peace with his new wife. When Brandon had to be very, very careful about what he said and who he said it to. And then, in 1536, Anne fell, and fell hard. She was arrested in May on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The accusations were spectacular. She'd supposedly slept with 5 men, including her own brother. She'd supposedly plotted to kill the king. She'd supposedly mocked his sexual performance and laughed about his inability to give her living sons. The charges were probably fabricated, almost certainly fabricated. The evidence was thin. The confessions were extracted under torture or threat of torture. The whole thing reeked of a setup orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, who decided Anne was a political liability and needed to be removed. Henry had grown tired of her. She'd given him a daughter, Elizabeth, but no sons. She'd suffered miscarriages. She was sharp-tongued and demanding, and didn't know when to be quiet. Henry had already noticed Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. Younger, quieter, more submissive, more appealing to a king who was getting older and more tyrannical. So Cromwell gave Henry what he wanted, a legal justification for getting rid of Anne, a way to annul the marriage and execute her without looking weak or capricious. A narrative where Henry was the victim, betrayed by a scheming, adulterous wife, rather than a tyrant who killed women when he got bored of them. Anne was tried in May 1536. The trial was a show. The verdict was predetermined. She was found guilty on all charges, sentenced to death. Her alleged lovers were executed first, 5 men, including her brother George Boleyn, beheaded or hanged over the course of 2 days. And on May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded at the Tower of London. Not by the usual executioner with an axe. Henry had imported a French swordsman who could do it cleanly. It was a mercy, supposedly, a sign that Henry still had some feeling for her. Or maybe just vanity. He didn't want the execution to be botched and ugly. Anne died with dignity. She made a speech saying the king had been good to her, and she didn't blame him. She knelt. She prayed. The sword came down fast and clean, and she was gone. Dead at probably 35 years old. Queen for 3 years. Executed on charges everyone involved probably knew were false. Charles Brandon watched all of this with satisfaction. He didn't participate directly in Anne's trial. He was careful enough not to get that involved, but he didn't defend her either. Didn't speak up. Didn't question the charges or the evidence or the suspicious speed of her fall. He just stood by while a woman was destroyed on fabricated charges and felt nothing but relief. Because as far as Brandon was concerned, Anne had gotten what she deserved. She'd been arrogant, disrespectful. She'd tried to push him out. She'd forgotten that royal favour was temporary, that queens could fall just as easily as dukes. Brandon probably thought Anne's execution proved he'd been right all along, that his survival strategy, staying close to Henry, waiting out opposition, never directly challenging the king, was superior to Anne's more aggressive approach of trying to control and manipulate. And in a sense, he was right. Brandon outlived Anne by 9 years, died in his bed, natural causes, still Duke of Suffolk, still wealthy, still in favour. But here's what Brandon either didn't see or didn't care about. Anne's execution changed the rules. It proved that Henry was willing to kill anyone. Even people he'd once loved, even people he'd moved heaven and earth to marry, even people who'd given him children. If you became inconvenient, if Henry decided you were a problem, your past service didn't matter. Your relationship didn't matter. Your blood didn't matter. You were dead. This should have terrified Brandon. Should have made him realise how precarious his own position was. Because if Henry could kill Anne, a woman he'd defied the Pope to marry, a woman who'd given him a daughter, a woman he'd claimed to love desperately, then what was stopping him from killing Charles Brandon? The answer was nothing. Nothing except Brandon's continued usefulness. His ability to make Henry laugh, his skill at reading the king's moods and adjusting accordingly, his willingness to grovel when necessary and support every decision, no matter how brutal. Brandon understood this. At some level, he had to, but he also seemed to believe he was special, that his friendship with Henry went deeper than Henry's marriage to Anne, that he'd survived this long because he was genuinely irreplaceable, that his position was secure as long as he didn't push too hard or make himself threatening. He wasn't entirely wrong, but he wasn't entirely right either, because by the late 1530s, Henry didn't really have friends anymore. He had servants. He had people who told him what he wanted to hear and did what he wanted done and disappeared when he wanted them gone. The idea of friendship, of equal affection, mutual loyalty, honest communication, that was dead, killed by paranoia and power and the blood of too many people who trusted Henry and died for it. Brandon adapted. He became more deferential, more careful. He stopped pushing boundaries the way he had in his youth. He focused on being useful rather than entertaining, on proving his loyalty through service rather than assuming it would be taken for granted. He led military campaigns when Henry wanted them. He sat on the Privy Council and supported the king's decisions. He helped manage the dissolution of the monasteries, the massive seizure of church property that enriched the crown and broke the power of the Catholic Church in England. He did what he was told and accepted what he was given and kept his head down when things got dangerous. And it worked. He survived Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour in 1536, survived Jane's death in 1537 after giving birth to Edward, the son Henry had wanted for so long, survived the brief, disastrous marriage to Anne of Cleves in 1540, survived Henry's marriage to Catherine Howard, survived Catherine Howard's execution in 1542 when she was found guilty of adultery. Probably actually guilty this time, unlike Anne Boleyn. Every time Henry killed a wife or destroyed a minister or executed someone for treason, Brandon was still there, still in favour, still alive, still useful. But there's something deeply cynical about Brandon's survival, something troubling, because he didn't survive through honour or principle or loyalty to anything except himself. He survived through flexibility, through his willingness to support whatever Henry wanted, no matter how brutal or unjust, through his ability to watch people be destroyed and feel nothing as long as it wasn't him. When Catherine of Aragon was cast aside, divorced, separated from her daughter, sent away to die alone in a damp castle, Brandon supported it, even though he'd known Catherine for decades, even though she'd been a good queen and a faithful wife, even though the annulment was legally questionable and morally wrong. Brandon sided with Henry because that's what survival required. When Thomas More refused to acknowledge Henry as head of the church and was executed for it in 1535, Brandon said nothing. More had been Lord Chancellor, a brilliant scholar, a man of genuine principle who'd given up everything rather than betray his conscience. And Brandon watched him die without protest. without speaking up, without risking even a whisper of dissent. When Thomas Cromwell fell from favour in 1540, the man who'd orchestrated Anne Boleyn's fall, who'd managed the break with Rome, who'd dissolved the monasteries and done all of Henry's dirty work efficiently and ruthlessly. Brandon was part of the group that condemned him. Cromwell had served Henry faithfully for a decade, had made him the richest king in English history through the seizure of church lands. And when Henry tired of him, when Cromwell's enemies saw an opening, Brandon supported his arrest and execution. Did Brandon have personal reasons to hate Cromwell? Not really. They'd worked together. They'd both been part of Henry's government. They'd both benefited from the king's favour. But when the moment came, when it was useful to support Cromwell's destruction, Brandon did it without hesitation. This is what moral flexibility actually looks like. It's not abstract. It's watching people you know, people you've worked with, negotiated with, maybe even liked, get destroyed and helping push them toward the scaffold. It's voting to execute people on charges you probably know are questionable or fabricated. It's prioritizing your survival over basic human decency. Brandon did this repeatedly, over and over, for decades, and it worked. He stayed alive while people around him died. But there was a cost. Not to Brandon himself, he died comfortable, but to everyone around him, to the people who thought his friendship meant something, to the people who believed he'd stand by them if things got difficult, to the people who trusted him. Brandon taught everyone at Henry's court a harsh lesson. Don't trust friendship. Don't trust shared history. Don't trust anything except power. Because when the moment came, when it was your life or someone else's, Brandon would choose his own life every single time. He'd sacrifice anyone, friends, colleagues, principals, to maintain his position. That's not admirable. It's effective, yes. It kept him alive, but it's not admirable. And it raises a question that's impossible to answer definitively, but worth asking anyway. Was Brandon a survivor or a coward? Was his ability to navigate Henry's court a skill to be respected or a moral failure to be condemned? The answer probably depends on what you value. If you're judging purely on results, did he achieve his goals? Did he protect his family? Did he die wealthy and secure? Then Brandon was remarkably successful. He started as the grandson of a servant and died as one of the most powerful nobles in England. He married a king's sister. His children married into prominent families. He built a legacy that lasted generations. But if you're judging him on principle, on loyalty to anyone other than himself, on willingness to stand up for what was right even when it was dangerous, he fails completely. Brandon never risked himself for anyone else, never defended a friend when it mattered, never opposed Henry on moral grounds. He just survived, and he counted that as victory. The alternative was to be Thomas More, to stand on principle, to refuse to compromise your beliefs even when the king demanded it, to accept execution rather than betrayal of conscience. More is remembered as a saint, a martyr, a man of unshakable integrity. His story inspires people centuries later, but More died screaming on the scaffold. His family lost everything. His head was displayed on London Bridge as a warning. His wife and children were left alone and vulnerable in a world that had destroyed them for his principles. Brandon died in his bed, wealthy, secure, his family provided for, his legacy intact. Which life was more successful? Which man made the better choice? There's no easy answer, because it depends entirely on what you think life is for. If you believe it's about maintaining integrity, standing for something, being able to look yourself in the mirror and know you never betrayed your conscience, then More won. His legacy is honour. His name means something. But if you believe life is about survival, security, protecting your family, living to see your grandchildren, building something that lasts, then Brandon won. He achieved every material goal he set. He thrived. He endured. Most people aren't Thomas More. Most people, if they're honest with themselves, are more like Charles Brandon. They make compromises. They prioritize their families over abstract principles. They do what they need to do to survive, even if it means bending rules, or abandoning people, or supporting things they don't believe in. They don't like it. They're not proud of it. But they do it anyway. Brandon was just more honest about it than most people. He didn't dress up his compromises in moral language. He didn't pretend his survival strategies were principled. He didn't claim he was doing what was right, or just, or noble. He just did what worked. And he lived long enough to die in peace. By the 1540s, Brandon was in his 60s, old by Tudor standards. He'd survived longer than almost anyone at Henry's court. He'd seen friends die, wives executed, children buried. He'd watched the jolly young king he'd grown up with transform into a bloated, suspicious tyrant who killed casually and trusted no one. And through it all, Brandon had maintained his position. Not through courage or principle, not through being indispensable or irreplaceable, but through calculation, through knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, through grovelling when necessary and celebrating when appropriate, through making himself useful without making himself threatening. By this point, Henry was barely recognisable as the young man Brandon had known. He was massively overweight. His leg, injured in a jousting accident in 1536, had never healed properly and caused him constant pain. He could barely walk. His temper was unpredictable. He'd go from generous to murderous in moments. He trusted no one, suspected everyone. The court was a nightmare. People walked on eggshells. One wrong word could mean arrest. One perceived insult could mean execution. The rules changed constantly. What was safe to say yesterday might be treason today. Henry's mood dictated everything, and his mood was impossible to predict. Brandon navigated this by staying away as much as possible. He spent more time on his estates, claimed illness when he needed to avoid dangerous situations, focused on managing his lands and staying out of factional fights. He'd learned that the safest place during Henry's final paranoid years was anywhere except court. But he maintained just enough presence to stay relevant, attended important ceremonies, served on the Privy Council when required, led a military campaign in France in 1544, his last major service to Henry. He was over 60 by then, too old to be leading armies, but he did it anyway, because the king asked. The campaign was mostly a failure. The English took Boulogne but couldn't hold it long. The whole thing cost a fortune and achieved little, but Brandon came home without disgrace. That was victory enough. He'd done what Henry wanted. He'd shown loyalty. He'd proven he was still useful. In 1545, Brandon fell ill. Some kind of fever, possibly pneumonia, possibly just his body finally giving up after decades of stress and political survival. He died at Guildford in August, still Duke of Suffolk, still technically in Henry's favour, still wealthy and secure. He was buried with full honours. Henry mourned him, or at least made the appropriate public gestures. Brandon had been Henry's friend for 40 years. One of the few people who'd known him before he was king. One of the last connections to Henry's youth, when everything had seemed possible and the world had been full of promise rather than paranoia. Henry VIII would die less than 2 years later, in January 1547. By then, almost everyone from his early reign was gone. The brat pack was dead or scattered. The wives were dead. The ministers who'd served him faithfully were dead. Henry died alone, surrounded by servants and doctors, his body a ruin, his reign a testament to what happens when unlimited power meets human weakness. But Brandon missed that. He got out just in time. Died before the final collapse. Died before the chaos of Edward VI's short reign and the religious turmoil that consumed England after Henry died. Died before he had to navigate a new monarch, new politics, new dangers. He died having achieved something remarkable. Not just survival, though that was impressive enough, but survival with wealth intact, with family provided for, with titles and lands and legacy secure. His children inherited his position, his name endured, his descendants married well, and continued to play roles in English politics for generations. Charles Brandon had won. By every material measure, he'd won completely. But what did that victory cost him? What did he have to trade away to achieve it? What did it do to him, spending decades being whatever Henry needed him to be, changing positions whenever necessary, supporting executions and betrayals and injustices because opposing them would be dangerous, watching friends die and feeling nothing because feeling something might show weakness? We'll never know what Brandon thought about that, whether he had regrets, whether he wondered, in his final years, whether survival had been worth the price, whether he missed the young man he'd been before he learned that everything, friendship, loyalty, principle, self, could be traded away for security. The records don't tell us. Brandon left letters, documents, estate records, but he never left anything that revealed his inner life, his real thoughts, his actual feelings about the choices he'd made. He kept those hidden, if he had them at all. Maybe that's the final lesson of Charles Brandon's life. That survival, in proximity to absolute power, requires you to hollow yourself out, to trade substance for safety, to become nothing more than what the powerful want you to be, to sacrifice everything essential, integrity, loyalty, self, for everything material, wealth, position, security, and maybe, just maybe, that's a price too high to pay. Even if it works, even if you live to be 60 and die in comfort, even if your children prosper and your name endures and everyone calls you successful. Because what's the point of surviving if you lose yourself completely in the process? What's the point of living a long life if that life is spent being no one in particular? Just a mirror reflecting back what power wants to see. Thomas More knew who he was right up until the moment the axe fell. He died as himself, died for something he believed in, died with his integrity intact. Charles Brandon died wealthy, but did he die as himself? Or did he die as Henry's creature? A man who traded everything essential for everything material and convinced himself it was worth it? We can't answer that, but we can recognise what his story represents: the seduction of survival, the way power corrupts not through active evil, but through gradual compromise, the slow erosion of self that happens when you prioritise safety over integrity for so long that you forget there was ever a difference. Charles Brandon survived Henry VIII. He outlived almost everyone else in the Brat Pack. He died in his bed while better men, more principled men, more loyal men died on the scaffold. But survival alone isn't victory, not if you have to become unrecognisable to achieve it, not if the cost is everything that makes you yourself rather than just a shadow following power around and hoping it doesn't turn its attention toward you. And in the end, that's the real story of Charles Brandon and the Tudor Brat Pack. Not that they were young men who lived wildly and loved freely and made their king laugh, but that they were men who learned, one way or another, that friendship with power is always conditional, always precarious, always ready to devour you the moment you're no longer useful, or entertaining, or appropriately grateful. Will Compton died quietly, having never pushed too hard, having kept his secrets and his silence. Anthony Knivett disappeared, having recognised the danger in time and extracted himself while he still could. Charles Brandon survived through emptiness, through being exactly what was needed and nothing more, through sacrificing everyone else to save himself. None of them got to just be themselves. None of them got to live freely. They were all performing all the time for an audience of one, for a king who could kill them on a whim and who became more willing to do exactly that as the years passed. That's not the life the Brat Pack thought they were signing up for when they were young men jousting in the tilt yard and drinking in the great hall and chasing women and imagining glorious futures. When everything felt possible and the king was their friend and the future stretched out bright and endless and full of promise, but it's the life they got. Because friendship with kings isn't friendship at all. It's employment. Dangerous, well-paid, potentially fatal employment, where the job requirements include sacrificing everything you are to become what you're needed to be. Charles Brandon was exceptionally good at that job. He kept it for 40 years. He died still employed, still useful, still whatever Henry needed him to be, still performing the role of loyal friend, even as the substance of that friendship had long since been consumed by fear and calculation and survival instinct. And that's his epitaph. Not that he was a good friend, not that he was honourable or brave or true, not that he stood for something or believed in something or sacrificed for something larger than himself, but that he was useful right up until the end. Useful enough that Henry kept him around. Useful enough that Henry never decided he needed to die. Just useful enough to survive when survival was the only goal that mattered. In Henry VIII's England, being useful was the highest compliment a man could receive, and the saddest, because it meant you traded everything else, principle, integrity, self, for one thing, continued existence, and you'd convinced yourself, or tried to convince yourself, that the trade was worth it. Charles Brandon survived, but at what cost? And was that cost ever really worth paying? History can't answer that for us. We can only look at his life, the spectacular rises and falls, the marriages and betrayals, the grovelling and surviving, and decide for ourselves whether we admire him or pity him, or simply recognise him as what he was. A man who understood power, who knew how to navigate it, who sacrificed everything to stay close to it, and who died having achieved every material goal, while probably, having lost everything that actually mattered. That's the truth of Charles Brandon. Not hero, not villain, just survivor, and all the darkness that word contains.